Yeah.
I have a hard time with mine. I always wind it around the mat.
Oh, it's really hard. Alrighty, folks. So I think we're gonna get started. Appreciate you being here, and I think there are some folks on online as well. I'm Debbie Ingram. I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Interfaith Action, and as you can see from the first slide there, this is a presentation on Proposition 2 that has been developed by VIA and then also borrowing heavily from the Vermont Racial Justice Alliance material, and Mark Hughes is the Executive Director of that. So we'll just dive right in. So I know you know this is on a very kind of tough topic, but let me just start off with talking about the legacy of slavery in the United States. The first documented slaves were brought to America in 1619. That's the first ones that we actually have records of. There may have been slaves from Africa brought over to America even before that. And then, of course, the British Empire continued to bring slaves from Africa steadily throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. And by 1776, slavery was legal in every colony. So the U.S. Census began in 1790 when the country was new, and it tracked both slaves and free black people between 1790 and 1860. And so in 1790, there were 698,000 slaves who made up 18% of the U.S. population, and only 60,000 free black people. And then by 1860, there were 4 million slaves. The country had grown at the white folks had grown at a faster rate, so that number dropped to 12.5% of the U.S. population. But still, there were only 400,000 free blacks in 1860. And next slide. But many more were transported to America. In total, 12 to 13 million Africans were transported to America as slaves over that long period of time. And then, of course, sadly, several million others did not survive the journey, because I know we're all familiar with how horrible, how horrific the passage was in ships, and many people didn't survive. And actually, some years the estimate was that up to 23% of those transported did not survive. Looking at that terrible set of circumstances, but then viewing how that intersects with the writing of our Vermont Constitution. In 1777, our first Constitution gave birth to Vermont. Sure, you probably know that we were not one of the 13 colonies. We were the 14th state, so we had been land claimed by New York on one side and New Hampshire on the other. And our Constitution kind of was the first thing to sort of declare that we existed as an independent group, and it was based largely on Pennsylvania's 1776 Constitution, borrowed a lot of language from that. And basically it was written in a weekend in Windsor, Vermont. And if you ever travel in that part of the state, you'll see, signs they tout being the birthplace of the Vermont Constitution. And generally, people who go to school here, or just if you've lived here for a while like I have, you're taught that our Constitution prohibited slavery, and along with some other kind of forward-thinking things, like that it guaranteed universal manhood suffrage without property requirements, and that it outlined an amendment process. And all three of those things are things that Vermonters are usually taught to be proud of. But let's look at what the language actually says in the first article of the Constitution regarding slavery. It's mostly been unchanged since 1777, so for the last 245 years. So Article 1 says that all persons are born equally free and independent and have certain natural, inherent, and unalienable rights, amongst which are the enjoying and defending life and liberty, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety, And then we get into the problematic part. Therefore, no person born in this country or brought from overseas ought to be holden by law to serve any person as a servant, slave, or apprentice after arriving to the age of 21 years, unless bound by the person's own consent after arriving to such age. So let's just pause there for a second with that highlighted in yellow. Just reading that, just hearing that language, what would you think that means? How would you interpret it? Yes. That children could be slaves. Yes. I think that is entirely the plain meaning of the of the language. I think any reasonable person today would interpret it that way. Now, historians will tell us that's not what they meant. So I'll get to that in a minute. But so that seems to me to be problematic. And then let's just look at the last part. I think is even more obviously problematic. So the green highlight is so people can be bound by law for the payment of debts, damages, fines, costs, or the like. That's another exception. So is that language familiar to you? Do you know where that? Indentured servitude. Yeah. But it's actually in another document, something very similar. Does anybody? Okay, let's go on to the next slide, please. It's actually it's similar to the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Because the U.S. Constitution says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So there's this exception in our federal Constitution for crime, which is not exactly the same as payment of debt, but it opened the way. So remember, the Vermont Constitution was written in 1777, and this was written in 1865. So guess where they got the idea? Okay, so far from being the first state to prohibit slavery, we actually opened the door to some exceptions. So that being the most glaring, but next slide, please. But also, so the other part, the yellow highlighted part, I will just first of all, the non-highlighted part, though I read to you, it does value liberty and independence for all people, so that is certainly laudable. But now, the yellow part, historians will say that age 21 clause doesn't mean what you think it means, and we had a lot of discussion about this in the Senate when we were first considering this. So pretend that you're little Angus growing up in Cornwall, England, and you're 14 years old, and your parents want you to have a better life. They don't have very much money, so they make an arrangement with an American businessman, and he will pay your Angus's passage over to the New World, and he will give Angus a job, and part of that will be that Angus learns a trade, but he also is paying back. He's indentured to the man. He's paying back his passage over. Now, what could happen, and what did happen, was somebody like Angus would go over to the New World, and they get here, and of course they don't have their parents anymore to speak up for them or to negotiate for them. And the businessman would then go, okay, it's going to take until you're 35 years old to pay off your passage over and all, and everything that I'm doing for you. So you're going to be indentured to me for that long a period of time. So that seemed unfair to the people who wrote the Vermont Constitution, and so they were being progressive in the sense that they wanted to cut off the date that you could only be bound until age 21, and then you would either renegotiate or you just be completely free. So once it's explained to you, right? Okay, that makes sense, right? But anybody reading the language of the Constitution you would know that, right? You'd have no way of knowing that. So really, effectively, it sounds like an exception, another loophole. And then, of course, the one that we just went over that contributed to the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is definitely, very obviously, an exception. that allows slavery. So next slide. So what you are being asked to vote on. So what the proposition to alter the amendment, to amend the Constitution says, and this will be on your ballot. So first of all, it says the purpose is to amend the Constitution of the state of Vermont to clarify that slavery and indentured servitude in any form are prohibited. And then the first part of the language is the same, that all persons are born equally free and independent and have certain natural, inherent, and unalienable rights, amongst which are the enjoying and defending life and liberty, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. And then strikes out all that other language, the yellow and the green highlights, and jumps down to say, therefore, slavery and indentured servitude in any form are prohibited. So this is much clearer, I hope, much more straightforward. And I'm also proud to say that I was the senator who introduced this language, and so it's very gratifying for me to see that this finally made it through the process, and this is what we will be seeing on our ballots. So let us look, though, at just again review what we've been taught about Vermont and what actually is really true. So Vermont actually has had some kind of constitutional slavery longer than any state in United States history. There's the original 1777 Constitution, even though it was revised twice in 1786 and 1793. There were no changes to that part. There was an amendment in 1924, but the very original language had separated women could be indentured up to 18 and men to 21. So they changed it so that both men and women were the same age. And then basically then if you look at other historical documents, you see that 25 states followed Vermont's example to establish an exception for punishment of a crime. 1779 in Britain, there was also a document, legal statutes written up to allow the same practice. 1787, the Northwest Ordinance, which set up laws for the new frontier as new lands were being settled, also allowed this. And then, as we already said, in 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution says the same thing. So if you follow the arc, started in July 1777, went to the U.S. Constitution was written in September 10 years later. The Civil War started, big jump in 1861. The Emancipation Proclamation, of course, was eliminated slavery in the slaveholding states that were being fought against in the Civil War. And 1865, the Civil War ended on April 9th, and President Lincoln was assassinated just 6 days later. The 13th Amendment was introduced shortly after that, and it was ratified at the end of the year in December 1865. And then, we are now celebrating Juneteenth because the information about that about slavery really being ended didn't make it all the way to all the territories until 6 months later, June of 1866. So then Reconstruction happened, and there were a lot of good things right after the war. There was a good start to trying to get rid of slavery and make that clear. There were Civil Rights Acts of 1866 and 1875, and they affirmed the equality of all men before the law. We had other equality problems later with that, but that was good anyway. And then they prohibited racial discrimination in public, in all public places, and made it a crime to deny accommodations or services on the basis of color, race, or previous condition of servitude. So Reconstruction looked like it was going to be a good thing, but go on. But what began to happen was black codes were established. And so in order to get around the more progressive, forward-thinking ideas of Reconstruction, states started and towns started imprisoning black people for vagrancy, loitering, and petty theft. So for very small, minor crimes that white people wouldn't even have been, nobody would have batted an eye. So they were actually imprisoned for those kinds of offenses, and then convict leasing became a very common practice. So the very plantation owners, or now some of them were business owners, who had been forced to free their slaves, now really colluded with a system that made sure that they got arrested, and then because they're in prison, they could use their labor. They could lease out their labor. And so then blacks also were not able to rent housing or to buy land. They were paid a pittance for their labor if they were paid at all. Sometimes there were annual labor contracts that they were forced to sign with the lowest possible pay. So it was very slightly different from being enslaved. So chattel slavery had been, sort of legally prohibited, but in practice it was still very much the same. Next slide. Black children were put into apprenticeships, ostensibly, of manual agricultural labor on the very plantations that where they had been born and where they were still connected to. The movements of blacks from their homes to shops, church, and lots of other places were monitored, and sometimes they were required to have passes or have white sponsors just to even travel around in their hometowns. So this then set up the stage for even worse things. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to all persons born or naturalized in the U.S., but the Supreme Court rulings of 1883, when states started to contest the amendment, that basically threw it out entirely and stated that the amendment was not infringed by uncodified racial discrimination. So basically, that means if it wasn't written, codified into the law, then all kinds of infringement could take place. So basically, discrimination could not be constitutionally prohibited. That was the ruling of the Supreme Court. So this really did then completely open the floodgates to Jim Crow laws. We've all heard of the legacy of these. There's segregation everywhere. Parks, restaurants, theaters, water fountains, restrooms. On and on. There were places for white people, places for black people. Marriage and cohabitation among blacks and whites were prohibited. Blacks couldn't register to vote unless they owned property, or sometimes they were forced to answer ridiculous arbitrary questions. And and these laws were prevalent in every region of the country. So basically then we moved from a system of chattel slavery, where it was just outright you buy another human being, to this kind of constitutional loophole which allowed slavery to exist in other forms, really. What started as convict leasing then also has been replaced by unpaid or underpaid labor by prisoners. Blacks are currently incarcerated at 6.4 times the rate of white people, and they are much lower in the general population. In the Attica revolts, if you remember that from 1971, the prison in New York, when the prisoners revolted, one of the big demands that they made was that there be labor unions and a minimum wage for those who were incarcerated, because their labor was exploited so much. And then even now, California can save money on fighting the wildfires there because they use prison labor. They've saved up to $100 million a year for firefighters by doing this. So we've swapped one idea for another, basically. And then the war on drugs has greatly contributed to this mass incarceration, which has then exploited black labor. And this went on under Nixon, Reagan, and Clinton, so without regard to party. And there are more black men in prison in the United States today than in the 5 most populous African countries combined, which is kind of astounding. The private prison industry, also for a business to get paid to incarcerate other human beings, is certainly, I mean, you can make the argument that that's a form of slavery. And then many people of color in Vermont will say that our practice of sending prisoners to other states to incarcerate them is basically a form of human trafficking, because we're sending people across state lines to be incarcerated. So this is a lot, I know, and kind of disturbing, but I'll stop here for a minute just to think about this this idea of kind of the movement from chattel slavery to incarceration, and the whole idea about what we've been taught about the Vermont Constitution being different from what what really is there. So would anyone like to have any questions, or you want to make a comment about any of that, or tell us how you're feeling? Yes. Yeah. Okay, so the question is statistics about how many people in Vermont were in the, and by that situation you mean chattel slavery? Yeah, very few. There were only about a couple of dozen people in Vermont who. That I'm not too sure about. There's the Stopping Stones. You may have heard of that. That project. Yeah, and but it was very prominent Vermonters that owned slaves. That was the Ethan Allen family that owned those slaves. So it's true. In point of fact, there weren't as many slaves in Vermont, but doesn't But the institution still existed, right? So, yeah. Any other comments or? That's just So for the people at home, Alyssa said, far from being the one who prohibited slavery, we're kind of the one who sort of paved the way for it to be a different the mass incarceration movement than it is today. Yeah, it is and it was hard for some of our legislators to sort of wrap their heads around this too. I have to say, but I'm sorry, what were you gonna say?
The other thing I was just gonna notice is that the only other thing I was gonna note is that you mentioned California and firefighting. Yeah. So California actually has a law that felons can't serve as firefighters. So you get trained and you get sent into these really dangerous situations all over the country, actually up to Oregon and everything, as prisoners to fight fires. And then once you serve your time, you are no longer allowed to do that. So it's, fabulous. Just another addition to that one.
Definitely, yeah. Thank you. All righty. Yes, Roy. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Thank you for that. Though Roy pointed out that human trafficking is a $150 billion industry in the sex trade, and it's really a very rampant, kind of a dirty little secret, though, almost, isn't it? Because we keep it under the radar. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, good. Okay. Well, thank you. All righty. Great. Well, let's move on. So there's another way also of looking at slavery, what slavery has morphed into, and that is in terms of poverty, because there's a huge disparity between people of color, particularly black people and white people, with regard to the freedom that they have of expending resources and buying necessities for their families. So this graph shows that the poverty rate from 1959 to 2019, black people have the highest poverty rate, even though it's come down some, but 18.8% versus white folks is at 7.3%. And then if you look at poverty in terms of median household income, again, the black folks are at the bottom in terms of income. So even in 2019, the median income was $45,000 compared to $98,000 for Asian people and $76,000 for white non-Hispanic Americans. So I don't know if any of you have had the chance to see a documentary called 13th that came out in 2016. But this is a report, a very brief report on it from Democracy Now! And she also incorporates the trailer for this documentary in it. So it's about 3 minutes. I wanted you to see this.
As we turn to a brilliant new documentary that chronicles how our justice system has been driven by racism from the days of slavery to today's era of mass incarceration. The film is directed by Ava DuVernay. It's called 13th, named for the constitutional amendment that abolished slavery with the exception of punishment for crime. On Friday, the film became the first documentary to ever open the almost 6-decade-old New York Film Festival. This is the film's trailer.
1 out of 4 human beings with their hands on bars, shackled, in the world are locked up here in the land of the free.
Khalif Browder was walking home from a party when he was stopped by police.
Then they said, we're going to take you to the precinct, and most likely we're going to let you go home, and then I never went home.
The 13th Amendment to the Constitution makes it unconstitutional for someone to be held as a slave. There are exceptions, including criminals.
The loophole was immediately exploited. What you got after that was a rapid transition to a mythology of black criminality.
Some people got the real problem.
Animals, beasts that needed to be controlled.
You better believe it.
I'm only human.
It became virtually impossible for a politician to run and appear soft on crime.
The kinds of kids that are called super predators.
Millions of dollars will be allocated for prison and jail facilities.
3 strikes and you are out.
It was an enormous burden on the black community, but it also violated a sense of core fairness.
Some people got the real problem.
States were required to keep these prisons filled, even if nobody was committing a crime.
It's so difficult to talk about mass incarceration because it has become heavily monetized.
The focus is on taking people from prison, putting them in community corrections, parole and probation.
How much progress is it really if now there's a private company making money off the GPS monitor?
We now have more African Americans under criminal supervision than all the slaves back in the 1850s.
We are the products of the history that our ancestors chose. Products of that set of choices that we have to understand in order to escape.
After all, don't put the blame on me.
That was the trailer for Ava DuVernay's new film, 13th. It will be released by Netflix on Friday. The United States accounts for 5% of the world's population, but 25% of its prisoners. In 2014, more than 2 million people were incarcerated in the United States. Of those, 40% were African-American men. According to the Sentencing Project, African-American males born today have a 1 in 3 chance of going to prison in their lifetimes if incarceration trends continue.
So that's a lot of horrible statistics, isn't it? And but has anybody had a chance to see that? Have you seen that film? Yeah, it really, yeah. It's I really commend it to you. It's really excellent, and it's available on Netflix. But so we certainly see how the mass incarceration is really just a modern day form of slavery, I think. So attempts to do something about all this, right? So let's try to look at switch to some more positive information. So there was an amendment to the U.S. Constitution to close the loophole introduced last year in June. Senator from Oregon and representative from Georgia introduced the Abolition Amendment to strike the slavery clause of the 13th Amendment, and that would be the 28th Amendment to the Constitution. And so that has just started on its journey, but in the meantime, many states are looking at their own state constitutions. So we could go ahead, please. All right, so this is a map which shows how many, so the yellow ones are the states that have some allowance for punishment of a crime. So you see that's quite a number of states. Alabama has still allows slavery. It's unconditionally. Yeah, that's horrible, but they are working on it. They're one of the states that's trying to change. And then there's Vermont there with our exception to it. So can go on. Thank you. So there is a national group called the Abolish Slavery National Network, and they report that 4 states abolished slavery in 2018. That was Rhode Island, Colorado, Nebraska, and Utah, which is good. Next. And there are several states like us that will have abolishing slavery on the ballot this year. Oregon, Alabama, thank goodness, Tennessee, California, Ohio, and Florida. And then there are 15 others that are starting to go through a process to abolish slavery. Next, please. Great. So why are we, what's one of the kind of ramification? What are some of the ramifications of passing Prop 2 here in Vermont? Well, we originally, the idea was originally to, it had an additional clause in it, the actual proposition itself, that to amend the Constitution because eliminating reference to slavery in the Vermont Constitution will serve as a foundation for addressing systemic racism in our state's laws and institutions. Now, the legislators had a problem with that, and so it was just sort of illustrative of the fact that we're, white people, we're trying to wrap our heads around things, and especially the committee in the Senate didn't want to include that part of the proposition as I originally introduced it. But go on. But those of us who are trying to get it passed are still thinking of the hopefully the conversations that we can have about systemic racism and the thinking that will be galvanized as a result of this. Actually, can I ask you, Lucia, to read, so you get a different voice besides mine, to read the first paragraph?
Sure. Systemic racism includes the complex array of anti-black practices, the unjustly gained political economic power of whites, the continuing economic and other resource inequalities along racial lines, and the white racist ideologies and attitudes created to maintain and rationalize white privilege and power.
Thank you. Yeah, and let's see. Can I ask you, Lisa, to read the second paragraph?
Sure. Systematic here means that the core racist realities are manifest in each of society's major parts. Each major part of the U.S. society, the economy, politics, education, religion, the family, reflects the fundamental reality of systematic racism.
Thank you. Thanks. And so this is a definition that the Vermont Racial Justice Alliance likes to use. It's taken from a book by Fegan and Ducey called Racist America. So I guess I know a lot of us are, we've been trying to read books and we've been having discussions and, we're trying hard to be good allies, white allies. But this, systemic racism is it's a hard thing for us to own up to, right? What's your reaction to this definition? description. I think it's good, yeah. I mean, I think it's very comprehensive, huh? Yeah. Yeah. Anybody? Yes, Roy.
They voted down the endorsement of the students. That went viral. What's that word? Viral. Went viral. And the next month, the select board had the largest meeting in the history with people from all over coming. And the man who led the anti-support vote got religion and turned around and led the revolt to endorse. But that deep-seated denial of truth is so entrenched.
It is. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So Roy was sharing the story of in Fairfax High School. The students wanted to put up a Black Lives Matter flag, and the school board meeting was very heated, and the school board president said, "There is no racism here." The select board president, sorry, and then a chair, and then they did, thankfully, smarter, more sensitive people prevailed, and they did reverse the decision. But it's just another illustration. Thank you for that of. Yeah, how hard it is. I mean, that we're hearing these things coming up in the news all over the place, right? And it's very. I mean, I'll confess I feel like I've been on a journey of, trying to understand the real legacy of our country and the real history, and the way that Black people experience our country much differently from the way that I have as a white person. But we have to, anyway. We need to keep challenging ourselves and listening to one another and having these conversations, I think. Okay, yeah,
It is mostly invisible to white people. That's one comment. Mostly invisible to white people. Another comment is racism is not just limited to blacks, however, other people of color as well. And a third statement is systemic racism is supported, unfortunately, in our education system still. How can the parents who are against curriculum changes be enlightened?
Yes, thank you. Good comments. That last question, I mean, I think, we're trying to use the discussion around Prop 2 as a way in. I think, educating people, sitting down, having conversations one with another. But I know it's difficult. It's really, it's really hard. I don't have a perfect answer for that, but I know we're all trying to engage with the people that we can and bring out the truth. Right? So if we could go on then. And then lastly, I want to kind of talk about the admission of systemic racism, or the identification of it with the United States by the United Nations. In July 2018, the UN stated that the United States remains a chronically segregated society, and they had several instances of proof I said that blacks are 2.5 times more likely than whites to be living in poverty, that black infant mortality rate is 2.3 times that of whites, that their unemployment rate is more than double that for whites, that blacks typically earn only 82.5 cents for every dollar earned by a white counterpart, that black household earnings are on average well under 2/3 of those of their white equivalents, and that black incarceration rates are 6.4 times higher than those of whites. So there's a lot of hard evidence for this, and that led them to make the statement that these shameful statistics can only be explained by long-standing structural discrimination on the basis of race, reflecting the enduring legacy of slavery. So sometimes I guess it's easier for people outside a culture to look at it and observe it and figure out what's going on. But that really is what, it's just from the very founding of our country, from the very moment when people were coming over from other lands to settle America, slavery came with it, and that is part of our legacy. So just to focus in on Vermont a little bit, we definitely have a lot of disparity here as well. Blacks make up 1.5% of our population, but they account for 25. Their poverty level is 25.9%. The percentage of the prison population, they're 9.9%, and the unemployment rate for blacks is 4.4%. Obviously more disproportionately represented in other ways. The median household income for black Vermonters is $39.4 thousand. For white Vermonters, it's $63.7 thousand. The percentage of Vermont black third graders proficient in language arts is a little over 1/3. For whites, it's 50%. Black students receive multiple days of suspension for disciplinary, as a disciplinary practice at 2.5 times their rate in the total student population. So many disparities here. Sometimes we like to think we don't have these things, but we do, and there's plenty of data to support it. The good news is that Vermont has attempted to acknowledge our systemic racism. The Attorney General and the Racial Equity Panel made the statements that while slavery has been outlawed in this country for over 150 years, the vestiges of it and of Jim Crow remain today in the form of systemic racism. So an acknowledgement that systemic racism exists. And we have created an Office of the Executive Director of Racial Equity to look at systemic racism in our government. And she's doing a great job. Her name's Susanna Davis. If you ever have a chance to see her, hear her speak, she's really excellent, but she has a lot of work cut out for her. So why do we need to pass Prop 2? Just to circle back around to our main purpose. Well, the main reason, the first and foremost primary reason, is because slavery is morally abhorrent and it should be unambiguously prohibited. I mean, that's enough of a reason right there, right? We want to remove any ambiguity, and we want to just absolutely get it out of our state constitution. Now, there are other things that we think can come out of this, but being part of the Abolition National Network, they have actually advised us here in Vermont, and they do this to everybody in all the states where this is on the ballot, to really focus, keep our eyes on the prize, to really focus on getting this proposition passed, because when we start talking about some other things that might happen, people get nervous. So we don't want to distract ourselves, although some other conversations might be had, and but anyway, we want to really just focus on getting slavery out of our Constitution. Another reason is that chattel slavery has given way to slavery in other forms, as we've seen, especially incarceration and poverty. And then to address systemic racism today, we must acknowledge the legacy of slavery. I think we're seeing all the vestiges of that and the violence and the hatred that we see in our country today. And I think, it's important for us as white allies to recognize that it's taking a toll, on us, too. Any system of oppression harms the oppressed in, very obvious ways, and very horrific ways, but also the oppressor. Martin Luther King said you can't keep a man in the gutter without being in the gutter yourself. I mean, just and especially as spiritual beings, as full human beings, to try to degrade other people and to defame the Creator that we believe in. It takes away from our humanity and who we are. And certainly in our country too, we need the contributions and the benefit of having many different kinds of people, and when we don't recognize what we're doing by oppressing some people, we're cheating our whole community, our whole country. So the process that we're following, that we have been following, is amendments have to originate in the Senate every 4 years, and so that was introduced in 2019, and they have to earn the 2/3 vote of the members of the Senate in the first year, and a simple majority by the House, and so that happened. That happened last biennium, and then the next biennium, it has to be voted on again. Then that time in the Senate, it can be a simple majority, and again in the House, it's a simple majority. And that they do go through, amendments do go through the committee process as well. So all those steps have been fulfilled. Now the House voted the second time on it, just like last week or so, I think. So the stage we're at now is that an amendment must win a majority of, oh, sorry, that's the bottom. So now we have to, the amendment, the very last one, the amendment has to go onto the ballot for all the state's voters to approve by simple majority. So that's what's going to happen in November, and that's why we're, doing these now. That's just the way it's been set up. Yeah, well, you don't want, you want to make it kind of hard to amend your Constitution, right? You don't want to make it just real easy to do. So, yeah, so it's just extra hoops. So, okie dokie. Great. So how you can get involved. So one thing, I did bring my little clipboard today, and I would appreciate it if you would sign it that you were here, and give me your email address if you don't mind. And I promise not to inundate you with emails, but and you can always opt out if you don't want to. But basically, this is one of those campaigns that, if you're looking for something to do that's social justice oriented, this is, it's a finite period of time. It's short. It's there are a lot of different things you can do, so you can pick and choose. So this is a good opportunity if you're interested. So in the spring, we're going to be writing letters to the editor and opinion pieces. We're going to be starting to do materials to go door to door and drafting flyers. We're going to be registering new voters. In the summer, we're going to start doing door-to-door canvassing and social media posts. We really want to encourage you and provide some training for you to have one-to-one conversations with people in your own network, which kind of gets at that question that we had live streaming, because I think, having those personal connections and trying to actually reach out to people that you know and explain, what you've heard will be particularly helpful. And then we're hoping to be able to do some public service announcements also on the radio. And then as we get closer to the election, we'll add in some phone banking and probably some public events. And then we'll really do an intensive get out the vote push in October. And the election day is November 8th. So, very happy to hear any other questions or comments from anybody about this. Yes. Yes, we do. Yes, thank you for mentioning that. We do. Yep. Yes. Yeah, the question was about lawn signs. Yes, we realized we should absolutely do that. Yeah, it's a really good thing in Vermont. So, yeah, thank you for that question. We do plan to have those too. Yep. Yep. And slowly working its way over. Right. So, any other things anybody wants to say? Or? No. All right. Well, I appreciate your coming, and yeah, I hope this has kind of illuminated what we're doing, and you know what the real history is. I know I don't know about you guys, but I'm finding, you know, sometimes I just go, wow, I was taught all these things, and it's turning out that, oh, it's not quite true, and it's kind of jarring, but we need the truth, right? We need to hear the truth. So, okay, well, thank you all very much then for coming.